My name is Curtis, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew my son better than anyone in this world. For 45 years, I watched Marcus grow from a sweet boy who collected baseball cards into what I believed was a decent man. But that Friday evening in late October changed everything I thought I understood about blood being thicker than water. Little did I know that weekend would teach me the most painful lesson about family trust and survival that I never wanted to learn. Before I share what happened, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because this story might change how you look at family forever. Now let me take you back to that Friday evening when everything started falling apart. Let me paint you a picture of who Marcus used to be, because understanding that makes what happened even more devastating. As a child, Marcus was everything a father could hope for. He devoured books like other kids ate candy, spending hours curled up in the corner of our living room in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His mother, Eleanor, and I used to joke that we had created a little professor. He excelled in school, never gave us trouble, and had this gentle way about him that made neighbors comment on what a polite young man he was. Eleanor was a registered nurse at the local hospital, and I worked as a maintenance supervisor for the city. We were not wealthy by any means, but we lived comfortably in our modest two-story home on Maple Street. The three of us were tight-knit, spending weekends fishing at Lake Michigan or working together in Eleanor's beloved vegetable garden. Marcus would help his mother plant tomatoes and beans, his small hands carefully placing seeds in the rich soil while she taught him about patience and nurturing growth. Those were golden years filled with Little League games where Marcus played second base with determination, if not natural talent. Family barbecues where Eleanor's famous potato salad was always the star, in quiet evenings when we would all gather around the television to watch old Western movies. Marcus would sit between us on the worn blue couch, asking questions about everything from how cowboys broke horses to why the good guys always wore white hats. But life has a way of changing people, and death changes them even more. 2 years ago, Eleanor lost her battle with breast cancer. It was a long, brutal fight that lasted 8 months from diagnosis to her final breath. I watched my vibrant wife, who had spent her career caring for others, slowly fade away, despite every treatment available. Marcus, who had always been close to his mother, seemed to retreat into himself during those difficult months. After the funeral, I expected Marcus to lean on me the way I leaned on him, but instead he became distant. His visits went from weekly to monthly, then even less frequent. When he did come by, conversations felt forced and uncomfortable, like we were strangers, making small talk rather than father and son sharing grief. I attributed this to his own way of processing loss, giving him space while I learned to live alone in the house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. What I did not realize was that Marcus had been asking increasingly strange questions during his infrequent visits. Questions about my health that seemed overly detailed for casual concern. He wanted to know about my medications, my doctor appointments, my blood pressure readings. He asked about my will, about my bank accounts, about whether I had made any recent changes to my financial arrangements. At the time, I thought he was just being responsible, maybe worried about my ability to care for myself as I aged. The truth is, at 72, I was still quite independent. Sure, my blood pressure required medication, and my doctor had warned me about my heart being weaker than it used to be, but I still drove myself to the grocery store, cooked my own meals, and maintained the house. Eleanor and I had called home for 3 decades. I had been careful with money throughout my working years, and between my pension, Social Security, and savings, I had accumulated around $300,000 in various accounts, plus the house, which was worth roughly $200,000. It was not a fortune, but it represented a lifetime of careful planning and hard work. Looking back now, I can see how Marcus had been circling that information like a vulture waiting for roadkill. But at the time when he knocked on my door that Friday evening with an unusually serious expression, all I saw was my son, who maybe wanted to reconnect after months of awkward distance. I opened the door with hope in my heart, thinking perhaps we could finally talk through our shared grief and find our way back to each other. Instead, Marcus stepped into my living room and said something that should have been my first warning. "We need to talk, Dad," he said, his voice carrying an edge I had never heard before. "There are some things we need to discuss about your situation." The conversation that followed was unlike any Marcus and I had ever had. He settled into Eleanor's old recliner, the same chair where she used to read her nursing journals and watch her evening game shows. But instead of the casual father-son chat I had hoped for, Marcus launched into what felt almost like an interrogation about my daily routine and health status. Dad, I have been thinking, he began, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. You are getting older, and I worry about you living here alone. What if something happened? What if you had a medical emergency? His concern might have seemed touching if not for the clinical way he asked about my heart medication. He wanted to know exactly which pills I took at what times and what would happen if I missed doses. When I showed him my daily pill organizer that contained my blood pressure medication baby aspirin and the nitroglycerin tablets I kept for occasional chest tightness, he studied them like a medical student preparing for an exam. How often do you need the heart pills? He asked, handling the small bottle of nitroglycerin with what seemed like excessive interest. Only when I get chest pains from exertion, I explained. Dr. Peterson says they are normal for someone my age with my condition. Why are you asking so many questions about my medications? Marcus set the bottle down and looked directly at me. I just want to make sure you are taking proper care of yourself. Mom would have wanted me to watch out for you. The mention of Eleanor stung, partly because I missed her desperately, and partly because something about the way Marcus invoked her memory felt calculated rather than heartfelt. Throughout our conversation, I noticed he kept checking his watch and glancing toward the windows as daylight faded. There was a restless energy about him that I had never seen before, like someone waiting for an important appointment or anticipating some significant event. When I offered to make us dinner, Marcus surprised me by saying he wanted to stay the night. I took Monday off work, he explained. I thought maybe I could spend the weekend here, help you with some projects around the house, just spend some quality time together. This was unprecedented. Marcus had not stayed overnight in my house since high school, and certainly not since Eleanor's death. Part of me was touched by the gesture, while another part felt increasingly uneasy about his behavior. But I pushed down my concerns, telling myself I was being paranoid, and that this was exactly what our relationship needed. As evening approached, Marcus made himself unusually helpful around the house. He insisted on preparing dinner, shooing me away from the kitchen when I tried to assist. While I sat in the living room, I could hear him moving around, opening cabinets and drawers with the familiarity of someone who had grown up in the house, but also with a purposefulness that seemed odd for someone just making sandwiches. When he brought me my evening medications with a glass of water, I noticed he had gathered both my landline phone and my cell phone from their usual spots. I thought we could have a technology-free evening, he said, unplugging the landline and turning off my cell phone. No interruptions, just father and son time. At the time, this seemed like a thoughtful gesture toward meaningful conversation, but something about the way he collected the phones and placed them in the kitchen drawer struck me as overly controlling. Still, I went along with it, hungry for any sign that Marcus wanted to rebuild our relationship. After dinner, he suggested we watch television together like old times. But the easy companionship I remembered from his childhood was nowhere to be found. Instead of relaxing into conversation, Marcus seemed constantly alert, frequently getting up to check the locks on doors and windows. Just making sure everything is secure for the night, he explained when I questioned his behavior. By 10 o'clock, when I normally headed to bed, Marcus had systematically locked every door leading outside and pocketed all the keys. When I commented on this unusual security routine, he brushed off my concerns. You can never be too careful these days, Dad. There have been break-ins in the neighborhood. I had heard of no such break-ins, but exhaustion was overtaking my ability to question his increasingly strange behavior. As I headed upstairs to my bedroom, Marcus called after me with words that now seemed chilling in retrospect. Sleep well, Dad. Tomorrow is going to be a big day. I woke around 2 in the morning with familiar chest tightness, the kind that had been occurring more frequently since Eleanor's death. Stress and grief had taken their toll on my cardiovascular system, and Dr. Peterson had warned me to take my nitroglycerin tablets at the first sign of discomfort rather than waiting for the pain to worsen. But when I tried to open my bedroom door to retrieve the medication from my bathroom cabinet, the door would not budge. The handle turned freely, but something was preventing the door from opening. Confused and beginning to feel more anxious as my chest pain increased, I pushed harder against the door, thinking perhaps it had warped and stuck in the frame. Then I heard Marcus's voice from the hallway, clear and calm despite the early hour. I would not bother trying to force it, Dad. I installed a deadbolt on the outside of your door after you fell asleep. The casual way he delivered this information hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, what are you talking about? And I need to get to my medication. My chest is hurting. I know, he replied through the door. That is kind of the point. Those 6 words changed everything I thought I knew about my son. The Marcus I had raised, the boy who cried when we found an injured bird in our backyard, the young man who had held my hand during Eleanor's funeral, could not possibly have spoken those words. But the voice was unmistakably hit a son. I do not understand what is happening here. Please open this door. I need my heart medication. Marcus was quiet for so long I thought perhaps he had walked away. But then he spoke again, his voice carrying a hardness I had never heard before. Dad, you are 72 years old. You have had a good life. Mom is gone, and honestly, what do you really have left to live for? The cruelty of that statement was breathtaking, but what came next was even worse. I know about the money, Dad, the $300,000 in savings plus this house. I also know you have not updated your will since Mom died, which means everything comes to me. I have been patient, but I cannot wait anymore. I owe some very dangerous people a significant amount of money, and they are not known for their patience. As my chest pain intensified, making it difficult to breathe properly, I finally understood what was happening. My son, my only child, was planning to let me die of a heart attack because he needed his inheritance money immediately rather than waiting for nature to take its course. Marcus, please. I pleaded, my voice weak with pain and disbelief. I raised you better than this. Your mother would be heartbroken if she knew what you were contemplating. His laugh through the door was bitter and cold. Mom is dead, Dad. Dead people do not get heartbroken, and you raised me to be practical. Well, this is me being practical. You're going to have a heart attack eventually anyway. I'm just helping it happen sooner rather than later. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes with me begging, and Marcus explaining his rationale with the cold logic of someone who had thought through every angle. He told me about gambling debts that had spiraled out of control, about loan sharks who had given him until the end of the month to pay up, about how desperate people sometimes had to make desperate choices. It will look completely natural, he explained. Elderly man with heart condition dies peacefully in his sleep. No one will question it, and I will be the grieving son who tried so hard to take care of his aging father. As dawn broke outside my bedroom window, I realized I was going to die unless I could find a way to save myself. Marcus had thought of everything, or so he believed, but he had made one crucial mistake. He assumed I would give up and accept my fate the way many people my age might do when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. What Marcus did not understand was that surviving the death of a spouse had taught me something important about the will to live. Eleanor and I had planned to grow old together, to travel and spoil grandchildren, and tend our garden until we were too frail to hold the watering can. When cancer stole that future from us, I had to choose between giving up or finding new reasons to keep going. I chose to keep going, and I was not about to let my own son cut that journey short for money. The first day locked in my bedroom was a crash course in survival and conservation. I had a small bathroom attached to the bedroom, which provided water, but food was limited to a handful of hard candies I kept in my nightstand drawer and a small package of crackers I had brought upstairs weeks earlier and forgotten about. My chest pain came and went in waves throughout the morning, sometimes mild enough to ignore, other times severe enough to make me dizzy and nauseous. Without my nitroglycerin tablets, which remained in the downstairs bathroom medicine cabinet, I had to rely on deep breathing exercises and trying to stay as calm as possible under the circumstances. Around noon, I heard Marcus moving around downstairs, the sounds of normal daily life drifting up through the floor. Television programs, the refrigerator door opening and closing, the shower running. It was surreal to think that just one floor below me, my son was going about his day while waiting for me to die. I spent hours examining every inch of my room for possible escape routes. The windows were too high for someone my age to safely climb down, even if I could figure out how to remove the screens. The door was solid wood and opened inward, making it impossible to remove the hinges from my side. The deadbolt Marcus had installed was clearly professional grade, not something I could pick with a hairpin like in the movies. But I did discover something interesting while searching through old papers in my dresser drawers. Hidden in the back of my sock drawer was a bank statement from 6 months ago that I had filed incorrectly. According to the statement, there had been a withdrawal of $15,000 that I definitely had not made. The signature looked like mine at first glance, but examining it closely revealed subtle differences in the way I normally wrote my name. Marcus had been stealing from me for months, probably practicing my signature until he could forge it convincingly. This was not a sudden, desperate act born of immediate financial crisis. This was premeditated theft that had been going on while he pretended to be concerned about my welfare during his visits. Late that afternoon, Marcus appeared outside my door for the first time since our early morning conversation. "How are you feeling, Dad?" he asked, his tone almost conversational. "Like I am dying," I replied honestly. "That is the idea," he said without a trace of emotion. "I brought you some water and a piece of bread. I'm going to slide them under the door. I do not want this to take longer than necessary, but I also do not want you to suffer unnecessarily." The absurdity of his statement would have been funny if the situation had not been so dire. He was killing me slowly while worrying about my comfort level during the process. The second day brought new challenges as my body began to weaken from stress, inadequate food, and the ongoing strain on my cardiovascular system. My chest pains became more frequent and lasted longer sometimes, accompanied by shortness of breath that left me gasping like a fish out of water. But along with the physical deterioration came a growing determination to outlast my son's patience. Marcus had chosen this method because it would appear natural, but that same requirement meant he could not simply wait indefinitely. Eventually, he would have to open the door if only to stage the scene for whoever discovered my body. I began rationing my energy more carefully, spending most of my time lying still to keep my heart rate low, but forcing myself to move around the room periodically to prevent blood clots and maintain muscle function. The small amount of water and food Marcus provided each day was barely enough to sustain life, but it was something. On the third day, I was approaching a state where I genuinely believed I might not survive much longer. My heart felt like it was beating irregularly, skipping beats, and then racing to catch up. The chest pains had become almost constant, and I was having difficulty concentrating for more than a few minutes at a time. But I was still alive and still thinking clearly enough to understand that Marcus was probably getting nervous about the timeline. How long could someone my age realistically survive under these conditions before concerned neighbors or friends began asking questions? That afternoon, I heard something that gave me the first hope I had felt in 3 days. The sound of a car door slamming in my driveway, followed by unfamiliar voices outside. Someone was visiting, and Marcus was going to have to pretend everything was normal while I was locked upstairs fighting for my life. The voices outside belonged to my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and what sounded like at least 2 other people. Mrs. Patterson was a retired school principal in her mid-60s, who had become something of a surrogate grandmother figure to the neighborhood children. She was also the type of person who noticed when patterns changed, and she had clearly noticed that I had not been outside for 3 days. I could hear Marcus answering the front door, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to appear normal under pressure. "Mrs. Patterson, how nice to see you. What brings you by? Curtis, dear," she called toward the house, obviously expecting me to appear. "I brought you some of those molasses cookies you enjoyed so much last time." "Oh, Dad is not feeling well today," Marcus replied quickly. "He is upstairs resting. Some kind of stomach bug, you know how it is." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried a note of concern that I found both touching and hopeful. "Oh my, he has been sick for 3 days. Perhaps he should see a doctor. At his age, dehydration can become serious very quickly." 3 days. She had been keeping track, which meant my absence had been noticed by at least one person who cared about my welfare. The question was whether she would accept Marcus's explanation or push the issue further. "Actually," Ms. Patterson continued, "I was wondering if I might just pop up and say hello. Sometimes a familiar face helps when you are not feeling well." I could practically hear Marcus's mind racing as he searched for a plausible reason to refuse her request. "I appreciate the thought, Mrs. Patterson, but Dad specifically asked not to have visitors while he is feeling so poorly. You know how men can be about being seen when they are not at their best." This was my chance, possibly my only chance. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I began pounding on the floor with the heel of my shoe, creating a rhythmic banging that I hoped would be audible downstairs. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps. SOS in Morse code repeated over and over again. The conversation downstairs stopped abruptly, and I heard Mrs. Patterson ask, "What was that noise?" Marcus's response was immediate but sounded strained. "Oh, that is just the old pipes. This house has always had plumbing issues. Dad keeps meaning to get it fixed." But Mrs. Patterson was not so easily dismissed. "Curtis," she called loudly, Curtis, are you all right up there? I continued pounding out the SOS signal, putting every last bit of my energy into making enough noise to be clearly heard downstairs. The rhythmic pattern was distinct enough that anyone who had spent time around Boy Scouts or military personnel might recognize it, and Mrs. Patterson's late husband had been a Navy veteran. "That does not sound like pipes," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "That sounds like someone signaling for help. Curtis, if you can hear me, keep making that noise." I obliged, continuing the SOS pattern, even as my strength began to fail. The physical exertion was causing my chest pain to spike dangerously, but this might be my only opportunity to communicate with the outside world. Marcus was scrambling for explanations, but Mrs. Patterson was no longer listening to him. Instead, I heard her speaking to someone else, apparently into a cell phone. "Yes, this is Margaret Patterson at 412 Maple Street. I need a police welfare check immediately. I believe someone is being held against their will." The next few minutes were chaos. Marcus tried desperately to convince Mrs. Patterson and the arriving police officers that everything was fine, that I was simply sick, and the noise was indeed old pipes. But Mrs. Patterson insisted that the pattern was too regular and purposeful to be mechanical, and the officers decided to investigate further. When I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, followed by someone testing my door handle, I felt a surge of hope that nearly brought me to tears. "Sir, this is Officer Johnson with the Milwaukee Police Department. Can you hear me?" "Are you in distress?" "Yes." I managed to call out, my voice hoarse from 3 days of minimal water intake. "I'm locked in. My son locked me in. I need medical attention." The officer's voice became sharp and professional. "Sir, step away from the door. We are going to force entry." The sound of the door frame splintering as the officers broke down the door was the most beautiful noise I had ever heard. As sunlight flooded into the room, I saw 2 uniformed police officers standing in the doorway, their faces showing shock at my obviously deteriorated condition. "We need paramedics immediately," one of them called into his radio. "Elderly male conscious but in obvious distress, possible cardiac episode." As they helped me to my feet, I could hear Marcus downstairs trying to explain to other officers how this was all a misunderstanding, how he had been trying to protect me, how I was confused and not thinking clearly. But the evidence was overwhelming. The deadbolt on the outside of my door, my cell phone and landline hidden in the kitchen drawer, my obviously weakened condition after 3 days with minimal food and water. When the paramedics arrived and began checking my vital signs, I felt the last of my adrenaline fade away, leaving me almost too weak to speak. But I managed to tell Officer Johnson about the forged bank signatures in my dresser drawer, ensuring that Marcus's crimes would extend far beyond unlawful imprisonment. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of medical equipment, concerned voices, and the overwhelming relief of being rescued from what I now understood had been a carefully planned murder attempt. My blood pressure was dangerously elevated, my heart rhythm was irregular, and I was severely dehydrated. The emergency room doctors told me later that another day or 2 under those conditions might have been fatal. While I was receiving IV fluids and cardiac monitoring in the hospital, the police were building their case against Marcus. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The deadbolt on my bedroom door, which required tools and premeditation to install. My phones hidden away where I could not access them. The forged signatures on bank documents that represented theft of over $50,000, spanning several months. But perhaps most damning was Marcus's own behavior when questioned by detectives. Instead of showing remorse or claiming the situation was a misunderstanding, he actually tried to justify his actions. He told police about his gambling debts, about dangerous people who were threatening him, about how he thought I would have wanted to help him if I had understood the seriousness of his situation. Detective Rodriguez, who handled the case, told me later that it was one of the most cold-blooded schemes he had encountered in 20 years of police work. "Most family disputes involve momentary anger or desperation," he explained. "But your son planned this methodically over a period of months. He studied your routine, your health conditions, your financial situation. He practiced forging your signature until he could do it perfectly. This was not a crime of passion." The formal charges against Marcus included unlawful imprisonment with intent to cause bodily harm, elder abuse, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and multiple counts of forgery and theft. When the case went to trial 6 months later, the prosecution presented a timeline showing how Marcus had been systematically draining my accounts while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. The trial was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, not because of the legal proceedings themselves, but because I had to sit in a courtroom and listen to detailed testimony about how my own son had planned to kill me for money. The prosecutor walked the jury through Marcus's method step by step, explaining how he had chosen a technique that would appear to be natural death while actually being premeditated murder. Marcus's defense attorney tried to argue that his client never intended for me to die, that he was simply trying to scare me into giving him access to my accounts. But the evidence contradicted that claim at every turn. The installation of the deadbolt, the removal of communication devices, the timing of the scheme when he knew I was having more frequent heart episodes. When it came time for victim impact statements, I stood before the courtroom and looked directly at Marcus for the first time since my rescue. He had lost weight during his months in jail awaiting trial, and his face had taken on a gaunt, hollow appearance that made him look older than his 45 years. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion behind my words. "I spent 45 years loving you, supporting you, believing in the man I thought you were becoming. I would have given you anything you needed if you had simply asked me honestly. Instead, you chose to try to murder me for money you were not even supposed to inherit until after I died naturally." The judge sentenced Marcus to 12 years in prison, noting that crimes against elderly family members represented a particularly heinous breach of trust that demanded serious consequences. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Marcus finally showed some emotion, turning back to mouth the words, "I'm sorry," in my direction. But those words felt empty after everything I had endured, and I realized that the son I had loved and raised was gone, replaced by someone I did not recognize and could not trust. Recovery from the physical effects of those 3 days took about 3 months, but healing from the emotional trauma proved much more challenging. The knowledge that someone I had loved unconditionally could plan my death with such calculated precision shattered fundamental assumptions I had held about family trust and human nature. For weeks after returning home from the hospital, I found myself checking and rechecking door locks, startling at unexpected sounds, and feeling anxious whenever I was alone in the house. Dr. Peterson referred me to a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery for older adults, and those sessions helped me understand that my reactions were normal responses to an abnormal situation. Mrs. Patterson became an unexpected source of strength during my recovery period. She stopped by daily to check on me, bringing homemade meals and simply sitting with me when the isolation felt overwhelming. "Curtis," she told me one afternoon as we shared coffee in my kitchen, "what happened to you could have happened to any of us. Evil sometimes comes wearing a familiar face, and that is not your fault." Other neighbors rallied around me as well, creating an informal support network that helped fill the void left by Marcus's betrayal. Harold Kowalski, a widower from 2 streets over, who had lost his wife around the same time I lost Eleanor, became a regular companion for morning walks and afternoon card games. We found comfort in our shared understanding of loss and the challenges of aging alone. One of my first major decisions during recovery was changing my will and financial arrangements. I could not bear the thought of Marcus eventually profiting from his crimes, even if he served his full sentence and was released while I was still alive. Working with an estate attorney, I restructured my affairs to leave the bulk of my assets to organizations that supported elder abuse prevention and victim services. The house on Maple Street, where Eleanor and I had built our life together and where Marcus had tried to end mine, needed to serve a different purpose now. I donated it to a local nonprofit that converted it into transitional housing for elderly people escaping abuse situations. Knowing that my home would help other people in circumstances similar to mine gave the terrible experience some meaning. I moved into a senior community apartment complex where I felt safer and less isolated, but where I could still maintain my independence. The move was emotionally difficult, leaving behind 40 years of memories, but staying in the house where Marcus had locked me away felt impossible. Gradually, I began volunteering with the Elder Abuse Prevention Program at the local community center, sharing my story with other seniors and helping them recognize warning signs of financial exploitation. It was painful to relive my experience repeatedly, but knowing that my story might help someone else protect themselves made the emotional cost worthwhile. The most surprising part of my healing journey was learning to trust again. After what Marcus had done, I expected to become suspicious and withdrawn, unable to form new relationships or believe in other people's good intentions. Instead, I found myself more aware of red flags and manipulative behavior, but also more grateful for genuine kindness when I encountered it. Harold and I developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than family obligation or history. We worked together in the community garden behind my new apartment building, growing tomatoes and green beans, while talking through our experiences of loss and adaptation. There was something healing about nurturing new growth while processing old wounds. As the second anniversary of my rescue approached, I realized that Marcus's attempt to end my life had actually led to a richer, more connected existence than I had been living in the isolated grief following Eleanor's death. The trauma had been devastating, but surviving, it had taught me important lessons about my own resilience and the unexpected places where help and friendship could be found. I never visited Marcus in prison, and I did not respond to the letters he sent during his first year of incarceration. Some people questioned this decision, suggesting that forgiveness might help my own healing process. But I came to understand that forgiveness did not require maintaining a relationship with someone who had tried to murder me, even if that person was my son. What I learned instead was that healing meant accepting what had happened without letting it define my future. Marcus had chosen his path when he decided my death was an acceptable price for solving his financial problems. I chose mine when I decided to keep living, keep trusting carefully chosen people, and keep finding purpose in each day I had been given. The final lesson came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, whose attention to my absence had saved my life, reminded me that we all depend on others more than we realize. "Curtis," she said one evening as we watched the sunset from my new apartment balcony, "independence is important, but connection is what keeps us alive. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who can hurt us deepest, but that does not mean we stop trusting. It means we trust wisely, protect ourselves, and never let anyone make us feel powerless again. Most importantly, it means we stay alert to the Mrs. Pattersons of the world, the people whose caring attention can mean the difference between life and death." What would you have done if you found yourself in my situation? Have you ever had to question your trust in someone you thought you knew completely? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or might help someone else recognize warning signs of elder abuse, please like this video and share it with others. Subscribe for more true stories about survival, betrayal, and the unexpected strength we can find within ourselves. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that every day we wake up is another chance to choose hope over despair, connection over isolation. Stay safe, stay alert, and never underestimate the power of neighbors who care enough to pay attention.